This afternoon, I'd like to address the aristocratic rebel in two ways. The first will revolve around Losurdo's method. This is a method that gives us readers of Nietzsche a wider context to Nietzsche's thoughts, to his theory, to his concepts. But more importantly, Losurdo's method really reveals what I consider the evolution of central Nietzschean concepts: eternal return, perspectivism, will to power, just to name a few. This is a method that combines philological, philosophical, and historical analysis. In short, it fundamentally changes our understanding and our application of Nietzsche's concepts. The main argument of Losurdo is that to truly get at the core of Nietzschean thought, it requires that we privilege the theme of revolution as the center, put it at the very center, and that revolution and counter-revolution, or reaction to revolution, namely the French Revolution, necessitated the development of a series of strategies that were bent on furthering, putting on the brakes to these impulses across Europe, primarily. Therefore, in Losurdo's presentation, Nietzsche can be thought of as a dialectical thinker in continuous reaction to the revolutionary tradition. The revolutionary tradition found expression in the worker uprisings of 1848, in massification, especially the problem of universal male suffrage in education, the broadening of inclusion of educational institutions, women's rights, and the problem of the ending of slavery. Therefore, Nietzsche should be read as an activist, as a thinker continuously refining both a metaphysics, a morality, and a series of concepts in response to political struggles. Now Losurdo argues the unity of Nietzsche's thought revolves more around history, genealogy, and morality than it does revolve around language, art, and aesthetics, which is, as you all know, the predominant philosophical view on Nietzsche that we have been trained in, both from the French Nietzscheans to the Anglo-American readers of Nietzsche, and beyond, which Tiana, I think, addressed very well. It is important that we take this Losurdo shift in emphasis seriously because it gives us a new rationale of Nietzscheanism, and we benefit from reading the guiding thread of his thought as a reaction to the advancement of modern political equality, as a reaction to democracy and to socialism, because this reading does not ignore the importance of art and aesthetics, but rather situates them in a different and important light. When it comes to those philosophers that do extract political insight from Nietzsche, Losurdo's argument goes against many of the predominant readings, from Brian Leader, who claims there is no political philosophy in Nietzsche, to Hugo Drocon, who argues that Nietzsche's grand politics possesses a trans-historical relevance for any sort of politics, to the French Nietzscheans such as Deleuze and Badiou, who turn to Nietzsche to fashion an ethics and a theory of subjectivity that is vaguely in line with a leftist political project. In the case of Badiou, in line with a communist project. Therefore, Losurdo's reconstruction of Nietzsche should not be understood as a historicist effort that merely shows the extent of Nietzsche's reactionary political commitments to virtue signal him, and then, by extension, guilt us readers of Nietzsche. On the contrary, I think that Losurdo's reconstruction demonstrates how Nietzschean thought contains a theoretical surplus of this reactionary agenda that is not merely an appendage to Nietzschean philosophy, but part and parcel of it. Losurdo asks us whether the revolutionary and emancipatory agendas that we possess on the left are even compatible with Nietzscheanism, and in what ways Nietzschean ideas compromise those commitments. In the second part of my paper, I want to offer an argument on how Nietzschean thought does indeed pervert these core commitments to the radical left. But to begin, I want to start off with a conversation on the Nietzschean concept of perspectivism. Perhaps no other concept illustrates better the ambiguous basis of Nietzsche's contribution to the left than does perspectivism. It is a very well-tracked and very well-developed concept in Aristocratic Rebel, even more so than his treatment of the eternal return or the will to power. Losurdo's analysis of perspectivism is exceptional. It is the best example of how his method of historical, philological, and philosophical analysis can situate a philosophical concept. Now, given that perspectivism refers to the notion that truth claims are fundamentally bound up with one's own perspective, it is hard not to decontextualize the discovery of this idea, i.e., it is hard not to relegate perspectivism to a mere epistemological theory. And we see this often. Perspectivism continues to be celebrated by thinkers who identify it as a precursor to postmodernism, such as Lyotard or Richard Woolen. And as Jeff Waite says, postmodernism might as well be called Nietzscheanism. Perspectivism is at the heart of this turn, and it informs much of contemporary theory, including the neo-pragmatism of Richard Rorty and other liberal anti-foundational philosophies, such as Emerson's. Perspectivism helps us understand the wider appeal of Nietzsche for some thinkers on the left as well, because it implies that a theory of the subject that is capable of eluding representation and circumventing epistemological conventions is indeed what we must be after. For example, in French Nietzscheanism, we frequently find the idea that Nietzsche's philosophy provides a certain ethics of subjectivity, precisely an ethics of self-destruction, of self-overcoming, an ethics that is brought in line with a wider theory of aesthetics and artistic becoming and sublimation. Therefore, at the heart of perspectivism is a rejection of the Enlightenment subject as an agent eligible for universal rights. This form of subjectivity stems from the post-French Revolutionary definition of the human being as one of universal inclusion on a representational basis. Nietzschean perspectivism, and by extension his ethics, seeks to enact an annihilation of this form of subjectivity. Quote, "The task is not who is man, but who overcomes man," as Nietzsche says in Zarathustra. The overman has nothing in common at the level of perspective with the species being of the dialecticians, as Gilles Deleuze writes in his study on Nietzsche. For Deleuze, Nietzsche's perspectivism is a break that sidesteps Christianity, socialism, humanism, egoism, nihilism, and all theories of history that are reliant on the dialectic itself. Perspectivism is thus at the very heart of Deleuze's theory of the subject, a theory which is founded in a split and a rupture, similar to the theory of schizoanalysis that he and Felix Guattari developed, which is very much indebted to perspectivism. Perspectivism is attractive to Deleuze because it opens the way for a new thinking of feeling, of evaluating, and ultimately of legislating values. In Logic of Sense, Deleuze takes up this idea of the destructive Nietzschean subject towards very creative ends, proposing an ethics of living up to one's wound. This is similar in a way to Alain Badiou's reading of Nietzsche's radical gesture of erasing one's proper name in a grand anti-philosophical act. In both instances, Nietzsche is a thinker who provides a set of philosophical insights, not for recentering the subject via the affect of recognition, but is brought into conversation as a philosopher capable of helping us think a radical decentering of the subject. In other words, Nietzsche provides the tools for thinking the subject as radically singular, split apart, and set adrift from representation entirely. Now, what Losurdo's comments on perspectivism provide is a proper context for understanding why the themes of annihilation, splitting, and destruction are so central for Nietzsche. As a doctrine, perspectivism is not merely a theory of the centrality of interpretation over objective reality or truth. It is also part of a political praxis that is bent on nominalizing, i.e. making fictional, the human subject, and by extension, annihilating its basis in universality. I want to get at the heart of why this emphasis on total subjective annihilation is so important for Nietzsche, and why this is also at the heart of understanding Nietzsche's ethical praxis. To properly grasp Nietzschean perspectivism, Losurdo invites us to situate it not merely as an epistemological debate that is responding to neo-Kantian theories of cognition, as the vast majority of commentators have insisted. Perspectivism is rather best read as a concept founded as a solution to a wider debate between realist and nominalist proposals of political truth and political thought that were occurring in a post-French Revolutionary context in Europe. These questions related to questions of historiography, questions of nihilism, and they were deeply in conversation with the budding tradition of historicism as Nietzsche encountered in de Tocqueville and in Taine, amongst many other historians that he read. Now, Taine and Tocqueville, both liberal philosophers, maintained a position of nominalism in contradiction to the Jacobin emphasis on real universals, right? So, in a way, the French Revolution reignited the old medieval debate on real universals and nominalism, but in a post-French Revolutionary context, the debate now shifted to a much less abstract set of stakes having to do with questions of the existence of God, to a much more explicit political context centered around the realization of the values of liberty, freedom, and equality, which have now been granted a real stake in political contestation through these various political upheavals. Tocqueville wrote, quote, "Realism is synonymous with socialism and despotism, with the absolutization of the whole with respect to the parts." For Tocqueville, who Nietzsche read closely, nominalism is synonymous with liberalism, and realism is synonymous with socialism. It was Hegelian philosophy that paves the way for socialism, according to Tocqueville and to Nietzsche. Now, Hegel rejects and refutes what Losurdo calls anthropological nominalism. For Hegel, freedom is marked by the construction of the universal concept of man. To quote Hegel, "The fact that today man as man is considered the holder of rights is to be considered as something great, so that the human being is something superior to his status. Now, as the source of law, universal principles are in force, and thus a new epoch has begun in the world." The Hegelian and later socialist commitment to achieving the unmet demands of the French Revolution insisted, therefore, on the real dimension to political values, and their realization in the world threatened to remove, if not fundamentally alter, the formal liberal commitments to these values. For liberals like Taine and Tocqueville, nominalism was a tempering move to realist impulses. These impulses posed a threat to the very status of the reality of class struggle if they were extended as a weapon of the working masses. In other words, if certain spheres of exploitation and domination, such as the persistence of slavery or wage labor, were to align with realist demands and universals, the status quo would meet its demise. Nominalism was a cover. It was a shelter from these demands, providing liberalism with the means for defending the status quo and maintaining a semblance of order and legitimacy. If these demands or domains of unjust political life had to be supported by appeals to nominalist relativism, sheltered from the demands of the masses, this raises the question of the status of the human as such in relation to the universal. And this is a topic that Nietzsche dedicates much of his philosophy to. In creating perspectivism, Nietzsche aimed to radicalize liberal nominalism by forging a radical subjective nominalism that was meant to retain a social order based on rank, order, and hierarchy. To quote Nietzsche from Antichrist, "Whom among today's rabble do I hate the most? The socialist rabble, who undermine the worker's instinct, his pleasure, his feeling of contentment with his little state of being, who make him envious, who teach him revengefulness. Injustice never lies in equal rights, it lies in the claim to equal rights." It is the difference around who is eligible to claim rights that makes the divergence in nominalist versus realist proposals of justice. For Nietzsche, the issue at hand is preventing the plebeian slave class, preventing their eligibility to even claim rights in the first place. What perspectivism thus furthers is a political epistemology, a strategy for furthering the social and political conditions where exceptional and brilliant individuals can remain the primary locus of subjectivity. Perspectivism offers a version of the human subject that might exist beyond these abstract demands of rights and representation that undergird the socialist realist basis of the subject. As you may know, the genealogical method Nietzsche develops in Genealogy of All Morals and earlier places the events of the 19th century, especially the crisis of the Paris Commune, at the center of a vortex of history that stretches back to the egalitarian realism of the Jewish and Socratic ideas of the human being, founded in Plato and in the Jewish priests, who both sought to found the individual subject on the basis of their wider social relations, i.e., in consciousness. Later, Cartesian rationalism, like the Socratic theoretical human being, which Nietzsche despised, suppressed an essential truth, namely, that we are not masters of the thoughts that arise in us. Our thoughts do not stem from our intelligence. They rather constitute modes of reaction in which are transmitted old physiological dispositions. For Nietzsche, the forces of nihilist resentment are engendered by the speculative, rationalist, and optimistic worldview espoused by Socratism and later Cartesianism. And it is perspectivism that offers the alternative to this orientation. Now, although Schopenhauer did not share the same aristocratic political agenda as Nietzsche, Losurdo shows that Schopenhauer's nominalism was the basis by which Nietzsche radicalized the idea of perspectivism. For Nietzsche, a society of rank ordering, committed to furthering otium et bellum, or leisure time for those whose lives have turned out well, was the basis of his political praxis. Perspectivism is thus best read alongside Nietzsche's explicit political agenda to, quote, go back by a long and devastating path to ensure that the natural and unbridgeable differences that existed among human beings are once again fully acknowledged by the division of society into castes. Now, as Jeff Waite has argued, Nietzsche's perspectivism aims at a radical annihilation, not merely of egoism, as many psychological commentators have indicated, but more specifically, it aims to destroy and occlude one specific form of consciousness, and that is class consciousness that is proletarian. The political context in which Nietzsche develops this idea is one in which realist commitments to universal rights only lead to dogmatism. By asserting the inescapability of singular perspectives and injustice, this was a way to assert the inescapability of rank order. With my remaining time, I'd like to offer a few remarks on Marx and Nietzsche. Where does Marxism fall in the realist nominalist context that I've tried to outline here? I want to suggest that what makes Nietzsche a perceived comrade to the Marxist left is in large part found in the way that he deals with this impasse and crisis of political epistemology. With this framework of political epistemology in mind, we can gain a better idea of why Marx and Nietzsche have often been thought together. Both Nietzsche and Marx saw wage slavery as a form of slavery. Wage labor was a form of slavery in both thinkers. The free human being bore an impressive resemblance to a slave, Losurdo notes, for both Nietzsche and Marx. For Nietzsche, the realist camp preached the importance of universality, but the people for whom this universality appealed were only the weak. The weak conceal themselves in the communal generality of the concept human being. For Marx, on the other hand, realist universalism is, quote, in continuity with Christian discourse. The concept of égalité that had emerged from the French Revolution ended up concealing or legitimizing the reality of exploitation and domination. And yet, this idea of equality was still something great. It expressed the unity of human essence for man's consciousness of his species and his attitude towards his species. We thus see that for Marx, as for Hegel, the realist appeal to universalism captures something essential and that is worth furthering. Yet, the realities of exploitation and oppression that most people undergo in capitalism occludes and hinders the possibility for universalism to be realized for all. If perspectivism was Nietzsche's break from this deadlock, we could say that the concept of ideology was Marx's break from the realism nominalism problematic. For Marx, ideology was a way to explain not only how the system of capitalist exploitation and oppression was legitimized at the subjective level, and how the suppression was transfigured as, quote, the fantastic realization of the human essence. Ideology was also, as we know in Marx's famous notion of commodity fetishism, that's one form of ideology, but Marx also, as we know, referred to Christianity as an opium, as an illusion of the masses, which concealed beneath it a real longing for a utopian form of tranquility and equality. Ideology for both Marx and Nietzsche had a direct referent in the way that religion treated suffering. And this was the expression, ultimately, of a real distress and of a real protest against exploitation. Ideology was therefore a solution for the concealment of suffering that went unacknowledged. Marx therefore criticizes the illusoriness of religious transcendence that 19th century working classes relied on, while Nietzsche, for his part, criticized the desire for transcendence, to which this dream and illusion, however confused and unrealistic, gave expression. We thus have two different critiques of ideology. One aimed to blow apart the false flowers on the chains in Marx. The other sought to legitimize the chains of serfdom and rank order, to legitimate the oppression perpetrated by the ruling class. Nietzsche aimed to do away with the very basis of ideological crutches, so that violence and oppression no longer needed to seek legitimation. Marx understood that Christianity's promise of flowers and transcendence concealed a realist demand for a form of life that was denied to the proletariat, which is why he will invent a theory of universality based on this exclusion of the proletariat. Indeed, Christianity was an opium for the masses, a consoling technique, and Christianity was not to be completely abandoned by either thinker. That's important. For Marx, there were conservative limits that Christianity's heavenly equality confirmed, or risk confirming, about worldly inequalities. Therefore, Christianity was forced to take on reactionary and conservative tendencies. And Nietzsche was by no means opposed to Christianity to court, by no means. He supported bourgeois and conservative forms of Christianity that reinforced rank order, and he supported, for example, the triumph of European Christianity in the Opium War in China. For Marx, Christianity was a socio-political institution that most often furthered reactionary agendas. But with that said, emancipation from false consciousness does not necessitate a pathos of universal reason for Marx and for Nietzsche, even though the status of the real dimension of universality was only partially illuminated under bourgeois society. Marx does not, as Nietzsche does, advocate the total abandonment of the universal or the complete nominalization of the realist dimension to values such as justice and equality. For to advocate this would only affirm counter-revolution. In short, what I think has been very attractive, unfortunately, to left Nietzscheanism is a certain, and you see this very well explicated in Malcolm Bull's Anti-Nietzsche, is a certain proposal that the cathartic moment of revolution is off the table, right? Gramsci had the idea that revolution possesses a certain potential for a catharsis, i.e., revolution holds the potential for resetting resentments and antagonisms, right? That what Nietzscheanism does is it puts the cathartic possibility off the table and swaps that in for a fundamental pessimism and I would say a fundamental commitment to the notion that a minimal degree of inequality is absolutely necessary in any revolutionary situation. So a certain marker of left Nietzscheanism is certain solidarity with that proposal of pessimism. I'll end it with that. Thank you very much.